My name is Jarrell James, but I also run a community treasury with my friend Yaz Khoury here, as well as
Hey, y'all.
9 other people. Okay, so we're here to talk about what does it actually look like in a community when you have architectures that are set up and that rely on the distribution of tokens, whether they be utility or otherwise, and where does that actually play in the roadmaps of these layer ones specifically, as you can see by this very cool graph. So you have here the blue equals the public sale, you have community allocations, which is actually ecosystem funds or airdrops that eventually will go to the community. You have insiders, including teams, companies, and VC purchase tokens, and you have foundations and more in gray. And so what's interesting, okay, and I recognize that yes, community allocations and foundations and more is a very similar color. You guys can take that up with Masari. I don't run their data science center. But I think it's worthwhile because Yaz and I have experience with specifically the Celo ecosystem. We both ran developer relations for that ecosystem for quite a while. So for us, we are really going to focus on a case study of the Celo ecosystem. But the truths that play out in these layer one ecosystems and foundation interplays are pretty standard across the space. I've heard war stories from the Tezos community. I've heard war stories from ETH and everyone really. But let's take a moment to look at how these architectures is laid out and what actually causes this reality of, where does the roadmap come from for a layer one? So if we look zoomed in, you can see Celo had a public sale of that big, not very big public sale. And then Foundation allocated 39% and 44% allocated to insiders, which once again includes team, company, VC purchase tokens. And then you have this large community allocation right here, which is money that will eventually go to the community or throughout ecosystem funding. And why I bring this up as specifically with just Celo is that one thing that people do know about Celo is that it's very mission driven. It's very mission focused project. There's a lot of play on bringing mobile cell phone usage and the Celo token and blockchain in general together and reaching these communities of 6 billion people around the world. And that's a very worthwhile mission, and I think a lot of people should focus on mobile infrastructure and UX. I focused on it for a long time, and I think it's a good thing to do. Now, let's go. One of the things that we did in the Celo community, even though we are no longer work at Celo, we run a community treasury with a bunch of other people, we wanted to raise the question of okay, this mission is really worthwhile. We're a couple years in. Where do we see the actual scalability concerns right now? Where are we seeing examples for us when we were working there? We saw a bunch of people come in through Coinbase Earn, and out of nowhere, the entire gas usage price of Celo shot up to it. Actually, if we're really going after these communities in the decentralized or in these emerging markets, the price of Celo and gas shooting up to 45 cents in a matter of an hour is actually a pretty big deal. And you can't go after these communities, but also accept that the scaling of the foundational architecture will inevitably price these communities out of it, even though you use them or we use them to get this message across and this mission across that is going to these mobile communities. So you have to scale that still keeps this community in mind. And so we introduced an idea that challenges a couple of the foundational architecture of how Celo works as a whole, but not with the intention of creating dissent. I focus on technical dissent because it's around scaling the mission. And Yaz can kind of just introduce that because Yaz worked on a lot of the validator stuff, and Yaz is cute, so.
Yeah, so in terms of the bigger picture, we propose a project called Mezcal. Now, what is Mezcal? It's a canary network for Celo for us to do a lot of R&D and quick iteration on a separate network that would actually support Celo long term. The main idea is we have to really think about how do you keep transaction costs cheap over the long term, right? So the idea of Mezcal was, we do something that's never been done before under one of the core mandates of Ocelot called radical experimentation, right? And the idea is simple. You create an L1 canary network with a long-term vision of migrating it to become an L2 rollup. And that's never been done before. And that actually, when we posted about Mezcal, the vision of Mezcal as a network to go from an L1 to an L2, not start out as an L2, but start out with an L1 and do that migration and try to get benefits from like different data availability solutions like Celestia. That became really viral as a proposal, and it sparked a lot of debate around different topics within Web3. Web3 people in the larger ecosystem were very interested in the technical aspect of the project, while internally there was a lot of
Let's get into
feedback.
that in a sec.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
like, I think one of the things we should stress is, ooh, nice, that the data availability is genuinely like the issue here for Celo as like a project. Like the more that we can scale the data availability aspect of it, that scales the mission. And so, yeah, we received a lot of what we would consider backlash. I think for a couple of reasons. I think that one was that we just released a blog post and we didn't actually think anybody was going to read it. We had like 100 followers on Twitter, and so it was like, all right, whatever. And then a lot of people read it, and so one of the things we didn't do, considering it was it's a multi-sig of 11 people, was we didn't disclose that Yaz was working at Celestia, and that's our bad. Honestly, Yaz is working at Celestia, everybody. That's happening. But there's a multi-sig of 11 people, so that was something that we had like community feedback on, and we took that criticism very well. But it wasn't actually the main community feedback. The main community feedback was like, what are you doing? This is outside of the vision of like Celo. This isn't like what we're doing. And really, it became obvious that there was a learning curve issue, and that like presenting concepts like this that are radical and have a lot of experimentation to them, you actually need to specifically like stress that, hey, we're not trying to take over the network, we're not trying to fork anything, there's so much trauma built up in Web3 as a whole that people immediately assume any kind of action is not necessarily altruistic, and that's totally fine, it's valid feedback. But one of the things we did have to ask ourselves as we watch people pile on and get involved, because there's a lot of people coming from the traditional Web3 or Ethereum community and others that were like, this is awesome, this is a great idea. And that's something where we had to realize, if we had published this paper in the Ethereum community, maybe our reception would have been completely different. And why is that? So we have to ask that question. It's like, why did we see a concerted, like, I guess, confusion, backlash, whatever you want to call it, around this in this community? And that's where I think we talk about, like, was it actually the community? And that is something that's a really worthwhile question. And ooh, got like something quiet in here. Like, ooh, what is it? Like, is it really of the community? When you have the people that are voicing the concerns on these public forums, one, the public forum is run by the foundation itself, but also you have the people who are voicing concerns on the forum are the like foundation sanctioned DAO that is like getting a lot of funding. You have projects that have all gotten funding through the foundation. You have everyone who's essentially has some kind of stake in a foundation funding pot, and as well as the token allocated holders for those projects that are coming up in these L1 ecosystems are not only the founders or the like people who are running the foundation on the insides, but they're also the VCs that have actually invested in the L1 itself, which is really bringing us back to this concentration issue. So now every single thing that's coming out of that ecosystem is still falling into this never-ending domino cycle where these insiders still take the full share of these projects that are coming out of it. A lot of it could be set off of hedging, like, hey, is there going to be a unicorn that comes out of this ecosystem? Is there something to this foundational like idea? Sure. But a lot of it is also just like getting control to some extent of what could be a very pivotal L1, and to some extent hedging L1s against each other. But don't worry, it's a multi-chain future. And so that's the question. So like when you have, for our specific case study, you have a community like Celo, but it's built out of a lot of projects that are taking a lot of Web 2 energy and applied it through like decentralized technology, which is making mobile apps, going after like decentralized poverty alleviation. Actually, like really, really cool, and the impact market guys have done some really, really, really cool stuff. But so, and then there's Valora, which is a wallet native to Celo, but it's built by the foundation and spun out of the foundation. And they work with projects like Grameen and do a lot of like marketing around this stuff. But in reality, like this mission of this project was like 7,000 people. This is like 30,000 people. This isn't something that's actually scaling up to be like 6 billion users worldwide. And that is something where we want to have more of a conversation around data availability and to hear people's thoughts. But what we did find out on this forum in the public space was everything that was a team coming from inside Celo may or may not have actually like have the space to discuss these ideas, because it deviates from like a founder vision, which is a monolithic L1, which is totally fine vision to have, and a lot of people have it. And we're just proposing a radical experiment. And that's where it comes from, is like, can you scale the mission in a number of different ways, doing a number of different experiments, and find the best solution over time? And not to mention, doing fun, cool shit in Web3 is exactly how you get fun, cool shit to get built by fun, cool people. Like, that's one of the biggest issues, is like opportunity cost of actual developer talent. And if you do stuff that copies and pastas everything that other ecosystem funds are doing, everything that everyone is doing to stimulate some kind of developer growth, can devs do something, where are the devs? That is something that you can just like bank on losing if you just copy and paste everyone's stuff. And so one of the things that we should do is radical experiments inside of ecosystems. We should take the data availability of other chains, and we should meld it and like make some Frankenstein monster just based off of ideas around scaling, because it's what's actually going to also attract cool, interesting people who build cool, interesting shit. So at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter what you really achieve with an experiment. It's like, just do cool experiments, because realistically, the community gets involved. And yeah, so that's us.